The 1920s were a very interesting time. It was a time of massive social change, breakneck technological progress, and drastic economic upheaval. These were unprecedented times, with rapid shifts that haven't been seen before, and in some cases haven't been seen since. The Great War has just ended, and all people back then wanted to do was let loose and go back to life as it used to be. Well, let's take a deeper look at how life used to be 100 years ago, the Prohibition era.
Lined with the boys and bums, spending their money, debauching their characters, rotting their bodies, and jeopardizing their immortal souls.
It was a common sight back in those days, women having to wait up at night for their husbands to waltz into the house in drunken flourish and sing off the roof before vomiting and crashing on the bed, leaving the wife to clean up the vomit. So, in response to what was seen as a far-reaching addiction to alcohol 100 years ago, women's groups along with progressives and Protestants got together and started campaigning. The result of their efforts was the 18th Amendment Bill, or the Prohibition Bill, was signed into law, and the sale and importation of alcohol became a crime. This bill was conceived and passed by Wayne Wheeler, the leader of the Anti-Saloon League, in 1917, and the Prohibition period was a 13-year period in American history where the production, transportation, importation, and sale of alcoholic beverages were legally prevented. The 18th Amendment passed to both chambers of the United States Congress in December 1917 and was ratified by the requisite 3/4 of the states in January 1919. The Prohibition could be traced to a bunch of factors. Most importantly, the religious revivalism that swept across the people of the country in the 1820s and 1830s. Society was growing less positive to the consumption of alcohol, which many started to view as a sin. With Prohibition came scarcity in the sales and provision of alcohol. Alcohol reserves were getting raided and dumped, and liquor just wasn't reaching hands the same way they used to. The 13 years of Prohibition was a very rocky time. Crime, especially organized crime, skyrocketed. Bootleggers, moonshiners, speakeasies, and the black market saw a major boom, with millions of Americans willing to do whatever it took to get their hands on a bottle. The desperation back then was palpable, and people were forced to take the trading of alcohol out of the daylight and run an underground system that thrived for years. While this usually meant going underground or even in dark alleyways to get alcohol, a very popular way for people to grab a drink in those times would turn out to be speakeasies. Contrast that with nowadays, when alcohol production and consumption is a multi-billion-dollar industry, and drugs like opium that were once freely available substances are now controlled substances. 2. The rise of speakeasies. Now, speakeasies had been in existence in the United States for at least a few decades before Prohibition, mostly tracing their origins back to the 1880s in the Pittsburgh area of Pennsylvania. At that time, it was a reaction to the passing of the Allegheny County Liquor Law in 1872, a local law intended to curb the sale of intoxicating liquors. For a while, they seemed like they would stay a regional thing, but on came the rise of Prohibition, and they would skyrocket into a cornerstone of American culture. Despite their illegal status, you would often see councilmen operating speakeasies and taverns, giving these establishments a semblance of political backing. They were a huge success at the height of Prohibition, and even though police and agents of the Bureau of Prohibition would often raid them and arrest their patrons, they continued to boom. With time, they evolved beyond just being a way to escape Prohibition and became go-to spots for some light entertainment, music, dancing, and just all-around letting loose. At the same time, car companies of the era were seeing their own boom. In addition to that, speakeasies signaled a wider societal change, as it became one of the first places where men and women could drink in public without social repercussions. The integration of women into male-dominated spaces like speakeasies would later translate into the rest of larger society, coinciding with the advancements in women's rights that would be won in later decades. Speakeasies, as unlikely as it looked at the time, moved people, much like the way automobiles were doing at the time, both literally and metaphorically. 3 people started owning cars for the first time. The car had been invented for decades at the time, but regardless, transportation before the dawn of the 20th century almost entirely consisted of bumpy, horse-drawn carriages and walking. But all that changed in the 1910s when car manufacturers finally figured out how to produce cheaper cars, sparking the dawn of the automobile industry. All of this was thanks to the Ford Motor Company, particularly the launch of the Ford Model T in 1924 that cost a paltry $260 on release. Suddenly, the automobiles that were once a luxury became affordable, and very soon they would become necessities. By the end of the 20s, automobiles would become by far society's most important consumer product. The advent of cars brought about a massive change in society and how people lived their lives. Before cars were everywhere, people who lived at factories had no choice but to live right next to it and deal with the resulting pollution. Now they could move somewhere where they they could have a more pleasant life, and they often did, all thanks to the car. It also connected rural areas to the city. By the end of the 20s, most farmers now had cars to get them to town and back. The country was now more linked than ever, with distance not being the problem it once used to be. All of this was good on paper, but in reality, the proliferation of cars posed a fresh set of problems, particularly in rural areas. Most rural roads were not paved like the ones in the cities were, so to transport themselves, rural drivers often had to endure dirt roads exposed to the elements, often leaving them dusty, muddy, eroded, and in generally unmotorable conditions. This situation frequently left drivers with damaged cars, and in secret cases, led to ghastly accidents. Eventually, people in the rural areas got fed up, sparking the rise of the Good Roads movement mid-20s, which would pay off in dividends when the Federal Aid Road Act was signed in the 1960s. This would lead to the road-building boom of the 1920s, which resulted in a sprawling national network of roads connecting every corner of the United States. This changed the face of what life used to be at the time. New industries were built and millions of jobs were created in order to meet the demands for automobile parts and fuel. Now, putting gas stations in every nook and cranny was a necessity, a matter of urgency. For the average citizen, this was when modern society was rebuilt from scratch, but with the face of the car. As Americans started to get around more, another problem surfaced. Cities became jammed with automobiles, and traffic snarls became a daily occurrence. Navigating the mass introduction of automobiles was uncharted territory, but people of the time didn't shy away from the challenge. By the mid-20s, localized traffic laws were already in place around the country, bringing a sense of safety to what used to be the Wild West of early roads. On the flip side, the growing popularity of automobiles sparked the move of millions of Americans from rural areas to developing city limits. People were leaving rural areas en masse to cash in on the boundless potential the cities held, which led to a housing construction boom. The legacy of this was the foundation of modern America and laid the groundwork for what would eventually become a booming middle class. Undeniably, though, the electrification of society at the time played a major role in all the progress being realized at this time. 4 American households started to get electrified. Prior to the 20s, electricity was a luxury almost entirely reserved for the rich and powerful. That started to change when utility companies discovered ways to make electricity more affordable through economies of scale, making it more affordable and accessible. By the start of the 1920s, little over 30% of American households had access to electricity, but just a few years later, in the mid-1920s, more than 60% did. And this completely revolutionized life for the average American. Electrification changed the dynamic of daily life for the average American, and suddenly they now had access to new life-changing machines and technologies like the washing machine, the freezer, and the vacuum cleaner. This took out a lot of the stress and monotony of household work, making life easier on the whole for people back then. This also led to a boom of inventions that used electric power in households and factories, which in turn increased the demand for them. By the end of the Roaring '20s, most American cities were electrified from the city to the farm. Talking about the farms, the rural areas of the time were also rushing to reap the rewards of electrification at the time and get up to par with the development in large American cities. People in urban areas almost across the board now had their houses equipped with the latest electrified gadgets. Groundbreaking gadgets like electric lamps, dishwashing machines, and the even more recent radio. The booming economy of the time ensured that these devices would spread like wildfire, even if it took a bit longer for it to get to rural areas. Nowadays, electricity is something we take for granted, something we understand society might fall apart without. 5 radios became popular nationwide. Radios had been around for decades by the time the 1920s rolled around, but they were mostly popular only in specific fields while remaining relatively unfamiliar to the rest of the American public. All that was about to change with the boom of radio programs that would occur in that decade. In the 1920s, following the First World War, radios would become more readily available in households across the world, and specifically the United States, and they quickly became the primary form of entertainment for people in those times. By the end of the 1920s alone, there were radios in more than 12 million households. It was a pretty common sight to find families back then gathered in the living room and paying attention to the radio, with the children listening sometimes while, other times, they played while the adults listened. The golden age of radio was a period between the late 1920s and the early 1950s, which had millions of Americans hooked on multitudes of comedies, dramas, and popular music shows. During American radio's golden age, much of the programming was controlled by advertising agencies. These agencies thought up the shows, hired the staff, and bought airtime from radio networks. Soap operas were the thing back then, and Ma Perkins curtains and the guiding light kept housewives occupied through the afternoon. Children were engrossed with cutesy shows like Little Orphan Annie and science fiction like Flash Gordon. Most famously, Wells's 1938 radio adaptation of H.G. Wells's science fiction series The War of the Worlds led to a wave of mass hysteria when listeners were led to believe Martians actually were invading Earth. Radios brought about familial and platonic connections that even extended to strangers. Perfect strangers bonded over conversations revolving around the happenings on the radio. It helped to facilitate the rise of music stars of that time. More and more radio stations were built, and the amount of people that owned radios also increased with it. But that wouldn't be the extent of entertainment in the 1920s. The movies were an even bigger sensation. 6 people started going to the movies. During the 1920s, movie attendance soared. By the middle of the decade, at least 50 million people a week went to the movies, the equivalent of roughly half the country's population. By the end of the 20s alone, Hollywood had grown into a major industry and was solely responsible for 83 cents out of every dollar Americans spent on amusement. In cities like Chicago, theaters had enough seats for half the city's population to attend a movie each day. The introduction of movies with sound, popularly called talkies, was largely responsible for the explosion in movie attendance in the later part of the decade. While it led many working-class movie houses to shut down from being unable to meet the cost of converting to sound, it made the moviegoing experience and standardized the modern cinema. Movie attendance saw a sharp surge in later years, and by 1929, upwards of 110 million people were flocking to the cinema. Movies were now the pastime of the average American, elevating the industry into a cultural staple. This also led to the birth of the modern movie star. In the early days of silent movies, the names of the actors and actresses appearing in them were often not credited because producers didn't want to give them enough fame to put them in a position of leverage to make demands for higher salaries. By 1909, actresses like Florence Lawrence and Mary Pickford were already incredibly famous regardless, even if the public remained unaware of their names. But come the introduction of sound, and actors were propelled into stardom. They started to become forces of personality beyond the movie studios in their own right, and for the first time ever, became household names. This marked the start of the juggernaut that movies would become, and the dawn of modern celebrity in the later part of the country. But it wasn't just the movie industry that was taking off around this time. 7 more people started to use planes. The first ever commercial flight took off on January the 1st, 1914, with just a single customer aboard, the mayor of St. Petersburg, Florida, who paid $400 for a 23-minute flight across Tampa Bay. Prior to this, planes were mostly used either for the war effort or to deliver the mail for the federal government. At first, most passenger-carrying planes could carry at most only a single person, and they were few and far between anyways. Most people at the time would take the subway or travel by car, and it might be hard to imagine now, but in the early years of commercial air travel, both methods were faster. All that would change in the 20s, but up till the middle of the decade, most commercial flights still catered almost entirely to the people wealthy enough to afford their expensive tickets. Flying by air at the time was a harrowing experience. Planes were mostly made of uninsulated thin sheets of metal that would rattle in the wind, so passengers stuck cotton in their ears to stop the noise. Cabins at the time were unpressurized, so passengers chewed gum to equalize the air pressure. Pilots and passengers both sat in open cockpits, completely exposed to the elements, so passengers wore overalls, helmets, and goggles. Regardless, the number of airline passengers in the U.S. grew from little over 6,000 in 1926 to approximately 173,000 people in 1929. Most of the passengers at the time were businessmen, and it soon became common practice for companies to pay for their employees to travel by air. This was also despite the fact that airlines at the time were a money sink, and passenger airlines would not realize profitability until the 1930s. For those who wanted cheaper tickets and didn't want to deal with the stress of flying by plane at the time, airships were an attractive alternative, the most popular of which was the Zeppelin. They became popular right at the start of the 1900s, taking off into fame with the successful launch of the Luftschiff Zeppelin LZ-1. Airships were first introduced to the United States through the Navy. They were very instrumental to the war effort in World War I, and toward its end, which coincided with the start of the 20s, the aircraft started to see mass adoption. They were roomier and more comfortable than the planes of the time. They weren't directly exposed to the elements, not to talk of the fact that they could accommodate more passengers than the average plane. The contrast between flying in early planes and going by airships was night and day. Airships weren't on the level of ocean liners, but flying in them was an incredibly luxurious experience, arguably more luxurious than air travel still is today. Each cabin had 2 bunks, and if you were traveling solo, you had to share one unless you were prepared to buy 2 tickets. There was no nightstand or chest of drawers, so you had to live out of your suitcase during the flight. The walls were made entirely of fabric, so you had to hope that the passengers in the next cabin didn't snore, or you'd have a very bad time. Restrictions on luggage weight were very severe, and you'd get additional charges included in your ticket if your luggage was above 25 kilograms. No flammable materials were permitted on board. The baggage restrictions were on the whole very similar to those imposed by the TSA today. The public areas of the passenger decks were luxurious, but the furnishings were quite sparse to minimize weight. The refreshments were usually quality, on the level that would make many patrons compare it to that of a 5-star restaurant. For in-flight entertainment, there was usually a small library on board, and the occasional piano was included in later flight, but that was it as far as it got. But after a few mishaps in the 1930s, airship travel would start to see a gradual decline in patronage due to safety concerns. The U.S. Navy lost all of its rigid airships to accidents in the 20s. First, the USS Shenandoah flew into a severe thunderstorm over Noble County, Ohio, while on an ill-fated publicity flight on the 3rd of September, 1925. It was torn into pieces, killing all 14 of its crew. Just a few years later, the USS Akron was caught in a severe storm and flown into the sea off the shore of New Jersey. A little later, on May 1937, the world's largest passenger Zeppelin, the LZ-129 Hindenburg, exploded while landing in New Jersey, killing all 13 passengers, 22 crew members, and 1 person on the ground. The fatal crash was caught on camera by television crews, and along with a string of other airship accidents, the Hindenburg disaster spelt the end for private flights on passenger airships. The crash of the Hindenburg was so particularly devastating for airship travel, not just for its massive size, but because of its icon status in the private airship industry. It was the pride of the industry, and once it fell, the industry went with it. Nowadays, planes are much safer and more accessible to the average person than ever. Ironically enough, with the progression of technology towards the end of the 20th century, airships started to become obsolete. Shopping became a major industry. With waves of groundbreaking innovations in transportation and a massive population shift to the cities came the rise of the middle class. And with that came the birth of retail chains. Towards the 1920s, independent regional stores started to get out-competed by large retail chains like Woolworths and JCPenney. It all started with Alexander Turney Stewart opening the first big city department store in late 19th century New York City with his Marble Palace. The idea of bringing a wide variety of merchandise under one roof, sharing staff payroll and utility, backed with advertising and real estate was a concept almost completely unseen before then, and it was a massive success. The rise of department stores replaced haggling with fixed prices. Customers could return items and get their money back if they weren't satisfied. Shopping for goods was more convenient as the process was streamlined. Prices came down and quality went up. The success and growth of Marble Palace led to the proliferation of other department stores in major cities across the country, a few of which would eventually expand into retail chains. The rise of these retail chains started from the expansion of small regional chains like the Great Atlantic, Kroger, American Stores, and National Tea. They began to gradually grow their presence, at first selling basic non-perishable foods with counter service. Not just that, but entering the 30s, these retailers were at the forefront of the transition from credit and delivery to cash and carry. And it was a massive success. Even by the start of 90/20, A&P alone was running an impressive 4,638 stores across the United States. In the early 20th century, since most women didn't work, shopping was an all-day affair. People would dress up to the nines and spend all day shopping around and stop for lunch. It was considered a social event at these times. Department stores in the 20s weren't much different from department stores today. They offered everything you could think of to get under one roof, from off-the-rack clothing that could be tailored or fitted to the customer to high-fashion menswear, shoes, gloves, accessories, and jewelry. Services like makeup and hairstyling salons were also pretty much the standard for stores of that era. Retail chains at the time got so successful and posed enough of a threat to the mom and pop stores that in 1926, a group of independent grocers in the Northeast banded together to form the Independent Grocers Alliance, a regional and eventually national trade group that allowed these independent stores to get the same wholesale discounts as the large chains, hence still keeping them competitive. expensive. Before then, many of these mom and pop stores were seeing a steady decline in patronage, and prior to them banding together, were almost certain to go out of business. Then in the 1920s, Clarence Saunders launched his Piggly Wiggly retail chains. These stores would be widely credited with introducing self-service shopping to the American public. The first store was opened in Memphis, Tennessee in 1926, and by 1929, there were more than 2,600 stores. The success of this retail chain led other grocery stores to follow the Piggly Wiggly model in the 1920s and 30s and converted to self-service. Macy's and then Bloomingdale's perfected the experience in New York City. The two retail chains were pioneers in offering higher quality merchandise to the average shopper, creating special sales on events or holidays, and to expand the shopping experience to include things like cafes and tea rooms, and the occasional live orchestras or string quartets. Eventually, department stores of varying sizes appeared in almost every town and city in the United States. Smaller stores offered less merchandise, and larger ones were constantly on the lookout for ways of expanding their customer base. The concept of bargain bins was born at about this time in the department store as well. Come the Great Depression in the 1930s, and food retailers started to find ways to lower prices even further. The end result of these results was the invention of the supermarket, popularly credited to Michael Cullen, whose King Cullen store in Queens, New York, broke sales records with its very low prices. Owing to the economic downturn, supermarkets of the time were often built from leased old factory buildings or other underutilized real estate, intentionally kept as bare bones as possible to keep costs low. So most of the supermarkets were just minimalist brick-and-mortar establishments that prioritized style over function. Even though that changed through the decades, society has generally circled back to those aesthetics today. The existence of these retail chains changed American life permanently, right from the 20s, at least in urban areas. It was from this point that items like toilet paper, cosmetics, and synthetic fabrics became staples of American life. Retail chains weren't the only thing that witnessed a boom in sales and customers. We've come to the end of our drive down memory lane, showing you how life was 50 years ago. Which one did you find most interesting? Was there anyone we missed? Let us know in the comments below. If you enjoyed it, don't forget to like this video, make sure to share it with your friends, and subscribe to the channel for more informative videos like this one. Until next time, bye for now.